Bulawanakan, a very good morning to all of you, and thank you for the invitation. The Pacific and the other small island developing states, or SIDS, share inherent challenges. Of course, our geographical distance from major trading centers, the small scale of our economies, and also worsening vulnerability to climate impacts. These are all hallmarks of the Pacific and indeed many of the SIDS. These challenges have all been compounded by a long-lasting bias from the international financial system. But even from our seat at the margins of global development policy, we have made marked development progress, but our inadequate access to development finance has hamstrung our ambitions. Now, the potent cocktail of COVID and climate-driven devastation has put much of that progress at risk. The disparity between the multi-trillion-dollar stimulus employed by developed nations stands as sharp and painful contrast to the reality on the ground in SIDS around the world. With a recovery already underway for the wealthy world, many SIDS find themselves stuck in time. The economic consequences of the pandemic are more serious than ever, which has left us more vulnerable than ever to the extreme challenge of the climate crisis. The gap between nations large and small, developed and developing, is collapsing into a chasm. Our recovery is at stake. Our development is at stake, as is the achievement of our SDGs. For decades, the inability of the developed world to understand the extent of our vulnerabilities, issues like the urgency of building resilience, were relegated to the back burner. This pandemic, on top of the climate crisis, has laid bare these inadequacies. We now have our last best chance to right course before this crisis inflicts permanent scars on the SIDS and indeed our development. We of course appreciate the development assistance provided by our development partners, as highlighted by the Minister earlier on. We are very grateful to Australia and New Zealand for providing the vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccines, 1.5 million doses pledge, which has been fantastically rolling out. Now we have one of the fastest rate of vaccination in the world. But we do know that we need to have well-planned strategy to mobilize more resources. And that strategy should not be held hostage to the geopolitical power plays of more larger, more developed nations. We need to sit at the helm of our destiny and chart our own way towards the blue, green and inclusive recovery we need. Fiji's pre-COVID development objectives were ambitious, but they will become aspirational now without a multifold increase in financial and technical support from our development partners, including the MDBs. And the MDBs obviously play a very critical role in terms of making accessibility to affordable finance. As you will see, there's a bit of disparity. The World Bank, for example, at the moment is making available concessional financing to middle-income countries in the SIDS, like Fiji, at concessional rates. So we're getting IDA funds. However, the ADB, on the other hand, does not consider climate vulnerability as a vulnerability consideration for middle-income countries. I mean, to put into perspective, the cyclone Winston in 2016 wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP within 36 hours. Now that's quite phenomenal, and to be able to rise back from that and continue with that economic growth path that we had, and indeed to be able to meet the SDGs becomes, highly, in certain instances, unattainable, unless of course we have accessibility to affordable and long-term finance facilities. We, of course, are forging robust relations with our new bilateral partners to accelerate climate action and strengthening ties with existing partners to support COVID-19 socio-economic stimulus measures. And as the Minister highlighted, the direct budget support by Australia and by New Zealand has been most welcome, in particular when your revenue levels have been completely shot through the roof. When you have 40% of your total GDP contribution by tourism, and completely coming to an end because borders have closed, you can expect your revenues to actually plummet, which therefore gives you very little fiscal space to be able to carry out the various agendas and programs and projects, both in relation to COVID-19 and also in relation to your general output pertaining to government operations, providing services, and indeed being able to mitigate the costs and expenditures that arise out of any climatic events. As we did experience last year, whilst we had some active cases, we also had a Cyclone Harold. So we had to manage the effects of Cyclone Harold whilst being able to provide those ration supplies, etc., but also to ensure that there's no spread of COVID-19. The second wave, of course, of COVID-19, like in many countries, is wreaking havoc in SIDS across the world, and we'll need far more support from the global community to free us from our current dire economic circumstances. Bilateral, multilateral, and philanthropic support need to rapidly transition from piecemeal project finance to program-based, ultra-long-term financial commitments that nurture transformative initiatives from pilot to implementation to scale. I take this opportunity to outline some key priorities from Fiji's perspective for sustainable economic recovery, for which the Pacific and other SIDS will require support from development partners and private investors, and indeed the MDBs. Economic diversification and growth that is led by the private sector. Pre-COVID-19, Fiji achieved 9 straight years of economic growth. This was unprecedented, which was led by a growing tourism sector that contributed up to 40% of GDP, as stated earlier. We will need to build back our tourism industry, and as has been highlighted, the provision and the expeditious provision of vaccines by Australia in particular, and of course New Zealand, will help us to get back our borders, to be open in some form, secure form, to be able to allow tourists to come to Fiji, and indeed it will give confidence to would-be travelers from Australia and New Zealand to come to Fiji if you have 70 to 80% of the population vaccinated. Tourism, of course, will continue to be a major economic engine of growth for the country, and we at the same time need to diversify our economy. We are building up our primary sectors. It's interesting, some of the so-called superfoods now, like turmeric and various other products, are now our second highest forms of exports to the USA. We are also focusing on our digital sector and renewable energy sector. We are looking at new areas like retirement villages. We have recently, an Australian company, Aspen Medical, has won a PPP project in running a couple of our hospitals. We believe that bringing in Australian standards of medical capacity and capability will help us in the long term entice those who want to invest in the retirement village space, and also, of course, be able to entice people who may be waiting in long queues in elective surgeries in the public health system, whether it's in Australia or New Zealand. The Japanese, of course, are very interested in retirement village space now that they know that the Australians will be running one of our hospitals and providing first-class international standard of medical care. Yesterday, as part of the budget consultations, I met with the BPO Council, Business Processing Outsourcing. We do have call centers, back-end processing. We want to build up on this particular sector. We have a population 99.9% literacy rate. Everybody apparently says that we speak in an accent that everybody can understand us, so they don't need to retrain our people. Somebody in USA or UK, Australia can actually understand us. There must also be synergy with the private sector, and private sector-led development is very critical for us in terms of building strategic fiscal stimulus measures that incentivize green and sustainable recovery. However, the mobilization of finance, technology transfer, and capacity building from development partners at unprecedented scale and speed is fundamental if we are to succeed. Lastly, increased capacity and resilience of the health sector. Despite comparatively having one of the more developed health systems in the Pacific, there is an urgent need to scale up and make resilient Fiji's health services to not only dominate the COVID-19 pandemic and protect Fiji from similar events in the future, but to also be fully functioning during climate-induced disasters and support a healthy working sector that can spur rapid economic growth. When taking into consideration history and the latest science, COVID-19, of course, will certainly not be the last pandemic to cripple the global economy or have an impact on the global economy at the very least. And SIDS health sectors need to be prepared for the future global challenges, including any other pandemic challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, Minister, the Pacific, along with the SIDS, the world over, has significant potential to be test beds for innovative solutions to climate change and sustainable green-blue recovery. In fact, we are already initiating trailblazing innovations. Fiji is working with the government of the United Kingdom to issue a blue bond by early 2022, having piloted innovative solar systems for rural electrification, and we are rolling out similar projects in the near term. This was initially actually facilitated through philanthropic organizations, combined with some bilateral support from the UK and from the Fijian government. A blended finance approach, which is really the way to go we hope can be replicated often as well too. Just by way of a side comment, we have issued green bonds a few years ago. It's listed on the London Stock Exchange. But as I've always said, it's become a bit of a cliche term for me now, is that the optics were great, but the interest rates weren't. So, we were issuing green bonds at 6.2%, which is basically the similar interest market rates that you'll get out in the private sector or in the open market. So I think there needs to be some creativity around our development partners, that if we are going to issue, for example, blue bonds, we need to look at the cost factor of that. There's a lot of opportunities, organizations, countries like Australia, the MDBs, etc., the UN that has got huge convening power to be able to bring people from the private sector who can perhaps be enticed to participate in the blue bond issue, but at interest rates that could contribute towards an affordable bond issue, without necessarily disrupting the market. But there's obviously a more deeper conversation needs to take place in that, and which I've been talking about in the past couple of weeks. Work is underway in Fiji also to develop a pilot for electric public buses, de-risking private sector solutions, climate-related insurance products, credit guarantees, concessional blended financing, and access to domestic green financing. The challenges, of course, are great, but we think that the solutions are before our eyes and within our grasp. If we're able to shift the boundaries of the paradigm in which we operate in, we'll only need to, of course, find the courage, the fortitude, and indeed the political will to recognize and indeed seize those opportunities. So with those comments, thank you very much, and I look forward to having further engagement, and wish you all the best for this workshop that you've got. Naka, thank you.